The bank teller smirked and tossed the ID back without looking, his voice loud enough for others to hear. "You need a real account to be here, sir." People behind him chuckled, but what they didn't know was the chair he once sat in still bore his name. He didn't speak, just smiled, and reached inside his coat. He walked into the bank at exactly 10:13 in the morning. The lobby was quiet, the floor polished so clean it reflected the low ceiling lights. His steps were slow but measured, each footfall accompanied by the soft tap of a worn leather sole. He wore a beige coat, loose at the shoulders, and carried a folder tucked neatly under one arm. His other hand clutched a wooden cane, not because he was too weak to walk, but because life had left its mark on his knees over time. His skin was a deep shade of brown, and his face carried the gentle folds of wisdom. Thick white eyebrows framed eyes that missed nothing. The security guard gave him a passing glance, then turned back to his phone. No greeting, no courtesy. At the teller counters, business moved on as usual. The old man waited in line behind a woman holding a baby, then a young man tapping on his phone. Nobody seemed to notice him. He was quiet, still, like furniture someone forgot to move. But behind his calm expression, his eyes scanned everything. The marble finish of the walls, the digital display showing loan rates, the 3 tellers on duty. The one on the far left was the loudest. The one in the center looked impatient, and the one on the right, a young woman, looked fresh. She was still watching how others treated customers, learning by observation. When the man finally stepped up to the front of the line, he took out a small note with a routing number. He unfolded it carefully, placed it on the counter, and spoke softly. "I'd like to inquire about this account." The teller didn't look up at first. Her name tag said Melissa. Her nails were long and painted red, and she was busy checking something on her computer. She finally glanced up, took one look at him, then back at the screen. "What is this, sir?" she asked. Her tone wasn't aggressive, just dismissive, the kind people used when they thought you didn't matter. He kept his voice steady. "I believe the account may be connected to a trust. I'd like to speak to someone about its status." She glanced down again, eyebrows raised, then back to him. "You have ID?" He nodded and reached into his coat, pulling out an old but well-kept leather wallet. He removed an identification card and slid it across. She took it with 2 fingers like it was dusty. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned the name. Then came the smirk. "Okay, Mr. Thomas," she said with a slight chuckle. "Let me see if you're even in the system." He said nothing, just kept his eyes on her. There was no change in his expression, no twitch in the corner of his mouth. Nothing but his eyes. His eyes looked like they had seen 1,000 rooms like this, and 1,000 tellers who thought he didn't belong. Melissa stared at the screen a little too long. Her fingers clicked the keyboard lazily, as if looking for something she already assumed she wouldn't find. The man stood patiently, not moving, not blinking. After a moment, she let out a small laugh loud enough for the next customer to hear. "Sir, there's nothing here under this name. Maybe you're mistaken. Maybe this is the wrong bank. Maybe." "You were supposed to be across the street," she added, half joking but sharp enough to sting. The people waiting in line behind him chuckled under their breath. A young guy in a suit leaned toward the woman beside him and whispered something while smirking. The teller next to Melissa raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Melissa continued, now with a tone that barely concealed her contempt. "I don't know what this is about, but this account isn't showing any special status. And just so you know, we don't open accounts without minimum balances anymore. Maybe this was from decades ago, or some clerical mistake." She turned the monitor slightly, as if to prove her point, though the screen showed nothing meaningful to the old man. He remained still, not confused, not insulted, just present. Melissa leaned forward slightly and lowered her voice just enough to sound menacing. "If you're trying to cash something or claim something that isn't yours, you're wasting your time. I've seen this before. People thinking they're entitled to things. Now please step aside. We have other customers waiting." Then she waved her hand, a gesture that dismissed him like an object, like an interruption, like an inconvenience. He did not move. Instead, he slowly looked to the side at the small security camera mounted on the ceiling. Then, back to her. His voice was even, quiet. "I haven't raised my voice, I haven't made demands, I simply asked a question." She rolled her eyes and looked over his shoulder. "Security. Can I get someone up here? There's a situation at window 3. The crowd behind him shifted with anticipation. Some smirked, some grew impatient, but none of them said a word to stop it. Not one. A tall security guard with broad shoulders and a badge on his chest appeared from the hallway near the loan officer desks. He looked around for a second before walking toward the old man. Melissa pointed with her chin. "He won't leave the counter. He's being difficult." The security guard stopped about 2 feet from the old man. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to move to the side. This counter is for account holders only." The man glanced once more at the teller, then took a half step back, not out of fear, not out of defeat, but as if choosing not to fight the storm he had seen coming before. The guard didn't wait. He stepped in and placed a firm hand on the man's shoulder, guiding him away from the counter. The folder the man had been carrying slipped slightly under his arm. The flap loosened, and part of a sealed document inside became visible. But no one noticed. No one cared. Melissa went back to her keyboard like nothing happened. The people in line stepped forward. The machine continued. The security guard's hand remained firm on his shoulder as the old man was gently but clearly steered away from the counter. He didn't resist. He didn't argue. His steps remained slow and dignified. He allowed the moment to unfold exactly as it was intended by the people who believed they had control of it. Melissa was already on to the next customer before he even reached the far corner of the lobby. The people in line barely noticed his departure. Some were checking their phones. Some leaned into conversation again as if nothing had happened. But one person did notice. The young teller at the far right. Station paused as her eyes followed him. She hadn't said anything during the incident. She hadn't moved, but something in her gaze had shifted. The old man reached the end of the line of chairs near the window and slowly sat down. He placed the folder back under his arm with care. His cane rested against his knee. Then he looked straight ahead. He wasn't looking at anyone in particular, not the guard, not the teller, not even the customers who had laughed under their breath. He was looking at the space between all of it, like he had already seen it 1,000 times. His face showed no trace of shame, no frustration, only patience, like a river that refused to rise in anger even after the rain. The sunlight through the tall glass pane behind him cast a dull glow across his hands. They were still, one resting on top of the other, wrinkled, knotted by age, but steady. He watched the movement of the bank's operations like a man watching. An old clock, not surprised by any of it, not affected by the ticking, just watching. And when the guard returned to his post and the world around him went back to its ordinary rhythm, he remained where he was, calm, silent, present. A question still hanging in the air that no one had cared enough to ask. At the far right side of the teller row, the youngest employee on the floor had stopped typing. Her name tag read Jamie. She was 23, just 6 months into the job, and still memorizing branch policy like it was scripture. She had watched the entire exchange with the old man unfold quietly. From the moment he stepped up to the counter, she had noticed his posture, the way he carried himself. His clothing might have been simple, but the way he stood wasn't ordinary. He didn't ask like a beggar or move like a man confused. There had been a quiet discipline in his tone. The way he folded the piece of paper, the way he spoke. It had stayed with her even after Melissa laughed and waved him off. When the guard walked him away, Jamie's hands had paused above her keyboard. Something in her gut told her this wasn't just another walk-in with a complaint. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't flinched when he was dismissed. That stillness, that silence, that look in his eyes, it was the kind of composure that wasn't taught, it was earned. She glanced over at Melissa, who was now helping another customer and laughing again, like nothing had happened. The rest of the lobby had moved on, but Jamie hadn't. She kept looking toward the man who now sat alone in the corner, upright, not slouched, as if he were waiting for a different kind of time to arrive. She turned slightly in her chair to get a better view. There was a folder tucked under his arm. It looked old, leather-bound, with a brass button clasp. It didn't look like junk mail or forms. It looked important. He hadn't opened it once. Not when he was speaking. Not when he was confronted. That struck her too. People who came in with complaints usually slapped down documents, waved papers, made noise. He hadn't. He had offered only a question. And now, he waited. Jamie turned her eyes back to her screen. But the line of thought refused to leave her. Something about that man felt out of place in the best way. Not like he didn't belong there, but like the place no longer recognized who he was. The security guard returned. This time he wasn't just responding to a wave from the teller. A manager had quietly gestured for him to intervene more directly. Whatever patience had been extended to the old man was now wearing thin in the eyes of the institution. The guard approached from behind, walking with purpose. He stopped directly in front of the seated man and spoke with a firm edge. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises. You've been told your business cannot be processed here today." The old man looked up slowly. His face was expressionless. He made no attempt to defend himself. He didn't reach for his folder or raise his voice. Instead, he placed both hands on the top of his cane and met the guard's eyes. There was a pause. Then the guard took a step closer. "This is your last warning, sir. If you do not exit voluntarily, we will have to call the police." There were no gasps from the crowd this time. No protests. The customers continued their transactions. The air conditioning hummed. Jamie watched from her seat, her fingers frozen over her keyboard. Melissa rolled her eyes at the commotion. The manager walked past with a clipboard and didn't slow down. The man nodded once and stood up. His movements were slow but exact. He adjusted his coat. He picked up the folder under his arm and straightened it gently. Then he turned to the guard and spoke in a calm, steady tone. "I understand it's happened before." The words weren't bitter. They weren't sarcastic. They were factual, like something recited from a long personal history, something deeply familiar. And for a moment, the guard hesitated. The calmness in the old man's voice wasn't born from weakness. It came from surviving something far older than that lobby. Still, the guard extended his hand and gestured toward the door. The man nodded again and began walking toward the exit. He didn't look back. He didn't speak further. But Jamie remained frozen in place, because in that moment something inside her shifted. She had seen people angry, people loud, people desperate, but she had never seen someone take humiliation and absorb it with such complete control. The door opened as the old man walked out. The sun outside was bright, his silhouette briefly framed by the glare before he vanished from view. Jamie didn't return to her routine right away. Even after the man was gone and the lobby resumed its rhythm, something in her chest felt unsettled. She tried to shake it, off typing notes from her last customer into the system, but her eyes kept flicking back to the space where he had been sitting. A few minutes later, she noticed Melissa left her terminal open while chatting with the manager at the far side of the lobby. Jamie glanced at the monitor. Curiosity edged into her thoughts like a quiet drumbeat. She leaned over and tapped the spacebar to bring the screen back to life. The ID the old man had handed over was still in the recent checklist. His name sat there on the interface in plain font, Arthur L. Thomas. Something about that name echoed somewhere in her mind, but she couldn't place it yet. She clicked once, opening the profile. The customer account data loaded slowly. When it did, she expected to see the standard error message or an inactive status tag. Instead, something strange appeared. The account had a red designation symbol. Next to it, a mark she had only seen once or twice before in training. She blinked and looked again. Yes, it was there. A red shield-shaped icon. Not for fraud, not for alerts. It meant internal permissions, restricted visibility, high-level oversight. She hovered her mouse over the icon, and the tooltip confirmed it. Tier 1 legacy profile, subject to executive clearance. Jamie's brow furrowed. That didn't make sense. Customers who triggered that label were either executives or accounts tied to board-level roles, the kind that required director signatures to access or alter. She scrolled down the metadata. Most fields were grayed out. She couldn't even view transaction history. But the account wasn't inactive. It was marked as honor-locked, a status preserved for legacy contributors, advisors, or founding members. She looked over her shoulder to make sure no one was watching, then clicked back. Out of the screen. Her heart beat a little faster. That old man hadn't asked for money, he hadn't shouted. He had simply asked about an account, and he had been thrown out. But based on what she had just seen, he had more authority than anyone in the building. Jamie sat still, her thoughts racing. She had only seen a Tier 1 designation once in training, and the trainer had said casually, "If you ever see one of these, you're looking at someone who built the place or paid for it." Her hands dropped from the keyboard and rested on her lap. Something about what just happened wasn't just wrong, it was backward. Jamie waited until the lobby thinned out. It was close to lunch and most of the morning rush had cleared. Melissa was still chatting near the break room, and the branch manager had gone into the glass office in the corner. Jamie glanced around once more, then turned back to her screen. She pulled up the internal directory, the one not visible to front-facing employees unless they had assistant manager access. It took a couple of tries to get around the permissions, but she knew how to navigate the training console in the back end. System. She searched his name again. Arthur L. Thomas. This time she added a filter through the legacy account database. The system paused. Then something unexpected appeared. A personnel archive, a scanned document, a ledger from over 4 decades ago. Jamie clicked on it. What she saw made her sit back in her chair. There was a photograph, a grainy black and white image embedded into an old file. In it stood 3 men in suits, one of whom was unmistakably younger, but clearly the same man who had been escorted out just an hour earlier. His hair was darker, his posture identical, his eyes carrying the same unwavering intensity. The caption read, "Founding Members Regional Community Bank Charter Signing 1981. Jamie stared at the name under the photo. Arthur Leonard Thomas, founder, chair of the initial equity board. It didn't stop there. She opened another file. Meeting. Notes from the first expansion committee. His name appeared again. A handwritten signature authorizing the purchase of the lot where the current building now stood. Another document confirmed he had served as senior advisor emeritus for over 10 years before retiring from the board. She blinked hard, then looked again. There was no mistake. The man they had thrown out of the bank earlier that morning had built the institution itself, literally, brick by brick. Jamie felt her face flush. Her fingers moved on instinct now. She began searching internal memos. Nothing recent mentioned him. It was as if over time someone had failed to pass along the story, or maybe had chosen not to. The old records were archived but never deactivated. His legacy was written into the foundation of the place, and no one on the floor knew it. Melissa didn't. The manager hadn't reacted. Security had manhandled him like a trespasser. She closed the file viewer and sat back in her chair, breathing slowly. Her thoughts were racing, but her face remained calm. Outside, the sun had shifted. A soft beam of light now touched the corner of her desk. She stared at the glint and realized this wasn't just about an oversight. Something had happened. Something dangerous. They hadn't just humiliated a man. They had erased a legacy. And now it was waking up. The next morning, the doors opened at exactly 9 o'clock. The lobby lights flickered on, the polished floors reflecting the glow from the high ceilings. Employees filtered in through the side entrance, some with coffee cups in hand, others checking their emails as they passed the front desk. Jamie was already at her station. She hadn't slept well. The file she had uncovered the day before still played in her mind like an unfinished sentence. She kept checking the door as the first customers began to trickle in. Then at 9:17 he walked in. Same coat, same pace, same folder under his arm. Arthur L. Thomas stepped through the glass entrance without hesitation. His cane tapped gently against the tile. Jamie held her breath. Melissa was again stationed at the center window. She looked up as the man approached, and the frown formed before he said a word. "You again," she said under her breath. Then louder for the others to hear, "Sir, we already told you yesterday this branch can't help you with inactive or unlisted accounts." The man stood quietly in front of her and adjusted the folder beneath his arm. "I'm not here for the teller counter," he said. I'm here to speak with the highest-ranking manager available today. Melissa raised an eyebrow and leaned back in her chair. The branch manager is with a client right now, she said flatly. If this is about what happened yesterday, I suggest you file a complaint through the online system. He didn't respond. Instead, he simply repeated his request with calm precision. I would like to speak with your senior-most manager, today, in person. Melissa sighed and turned in her chair. She picked up the internal phone and pressed a button. Yes, I've got someone here again asking for upper management. Same guy from yesterday says it's urgent. Pause. Another sigh. Okay. Fine. She turned back to him. Go wait by the chairs. Someone will be down in a minute. Jamie watched the exchange, without blinking. Something felt different this time. The man was not just present. He was composed like someone walking into a room he already owned. He stepped away from the counter and sat in the same chair near the window. His folder remained closed. His cane rested by his foot. His eyes didn't move. He wasn't scanning the room anymore. He was waiting. And Jamie knew then that this was no longer a misunderstanding. This was the beginning of something. Melissa tapped her nails on the counter and mumbled something to herself. Then, after a moment, the branch manager appeared from the glass office upstairs. He was wearing a suit too sharp for comfort and a look that said he had been pulled away from something he didn't want to leave. He walked down the side stairs and over to the old man. You requested to see someone, he asked with a polite but impatient tone. Arthur stood up slowly, his voice steady. I have a matter regarding the chartered ownership of this building and several outstanding rights not currently honored by this location. I would prefer to speak with someone qualified to interpret those documents. The manager blinked. Sir, are you claiming you own something in this facility? The man reached into his folder slowly and withdrew a single document sealed in protective plastic. It was folded once down the center, the paper browned slightly by age. The manager took one look at the heading and stopped speaking. The seal. At the top of the page shimmered faintly under the lights. Jamie couldn't hear what was said next, but she saw the manager's face change. The lines around his mouth tightened. He looked up quickly and scanned the room. He motioned toward the hallway. Please step into my office, sir. The man nodded once and walked calmly past Melissa, who sat there frozen for the first time since she took the job. Jamie didn't look away. Something irreversible had just begun. The office was small but quiet, tucked in the corner of the second floor with frosted glass walls and a desk too large for the space. The branch manager closed the door gently behind him, motioned toward the chair across from his desk, then sat down slowly. Arthur placed the sealed document folder on the table and opened it with deliberate care. He pulled out 3 items. The first was a photocopy of the original articles of incorporation bearing the state seal. The second was a signed ledger from the founding board showing disbursement of initial capital. And the third was a letter on formal letterhead addressed to him by the former CEO of the parent holding company, dated over 20 years ago, referring to him as Chairman Emeritus. The manager leaned in as his eyes scanned each document. The color drained from his face slowly. He didn't speak right. Away. He picked up the articles of incorporation and looked closer. The signature at the bottom matched the name that had been entered in the customer database the day before. He blinked again and then looked at the old man sitting across from him. Sir, I think we may have made a serious mistake. Arthur gave a single nod. That may be accurate. The manager cleared his throat and stood up. I'd like to make a phone call to our regional office. There are people who need to see these documents. Arthur did not move. I'll wait. Please take your time. The manager stepped out of the office and vanished down the hallway. 10 minutes passed, then 15. When he returned, he wasn't alone. Another man came with him. Younger, dark suit, regional director badge clipped to his lapel. The 2 men re-entered the office and shut the door behind them. Mr. Thomas, the younger man, said without hesitation, I apologize for how you were treated. I was unaware of your visit yesterday. Had I known, I assure you, things would have gone differently. Arthur didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked directly at the younger man and asked a single question. Is this bank still operating under the original charter? The director straightened his posture. Yes, sir. The ownership structure has evolved under the holding company, but the original charter for this location and its founding records remain active and recognized. Arthur tapped the Articles of Incorporation with a fingertip. And does that charter include my retained authority as legacy consultant with audit privilege? The younger man hesitated, then nodded. Yes. Arthur folded his hands. Then I would like to exercise that privilege now. I would like a full review of current operations, staffing, community lending practices, internal hiring metrics, starting with this branch. The room fell completely silent. The regional director's jaw tightened as he realized this wasn't just a legacy founder coming to visit. This was a founder invoking dormant authority, and there was nothing in the current legal framework that could stop him. Arthur stood and returned the documents to his folder. I will return tomorrow with legal representation. I expect to meet with your compliance officer. If you do not have one on site, I suggest you arrange for someone from corporate to attend. Then, without another word, he turned and opened the door himself. He walked down the stairs as calmly as he had entered. In the lobby, Melissa stood like a statue. The branch manager followed behind him at a respectful distance. Jamie looked up from her screen as Arthur passed. Their eyes met for half a second, and in that brief glance he nodded once, not as a greeting, but as confirmation. Everything she had suspected was true. By noon, the phones at regional headquarters were already ringing. Word traveled faster than expected. The documents Arthur had presented were scanned and emailed directly to the legal department of the parent company and forwarded to the executive board within the hour. The headline of the internal email read, "Urgent Legacy Authority Review Requested." It didn't take long before the bank's central office realized that the man who had been escorted out 2 days earlier was not only the founder of the original chartered branch, but also still held a legally binding advisory role as written in the original Articles of Formation. The regional director spent the afternoon in video calls trying to manage the fallout. His voice was calm, but his eyes flicked nervously at the corners of his screen. He called the branch manager twice, instructing him to cooperate fully with whatever the man requested. Then he called the Human Resources Department and requested a background compliance review on all employees at the branch. Every file, every complaint, every customer service report over the last 18 months, Melissa was pulled aside by the assistant manager and told to sit in the back office until further notice. She asked why and was told this was a routine review due to an ongoing audit. When she asked if it had anything to do with the man from the day before, the answer was a silent nod. Jamie kept her head down at her desk, but her ears were listening to everything. The energy in the building had changed. It wasn't just tension, it was fear, not fear of punishment, but of exposure. By mid-afternoon, a security consultant from headquarters arrived with a laptop and a portable scanner. He requested access to the branch surveillance footage and began pulling files from the previous 2 days. Footage of the original incident at the teller window. Footage of the moment. Security had laid hands on Arthur. Footage of Melissa's facial expressions. Every second was logged. The consultant didn't speak much. He just kept taking notes. In the corner of the main lobby, Jamie watched as he worked and wondered just how deep this review would go. Upstairs, the branch manager was pacing inside his office while on the phone with someone from corporate. His gestures were sharp and defensive. He glanced toward the hallway more than once. At one point, he pulled the blinds shut. By 4 o'clock, the entire team received an email titled Staff Notice. It informed them that the branch was under scheduled operational review and that all internal communications were to be logged and saved until further notice. Staff were instructed to cooperate with external auditors. Jamie read the email 3 times. Scheduled was not the right word. Nothing about this was scheduled. This was the beginning of a storm, and everyone could feel it. The following morning, Arthur arrived at the branch before it opened. He wore a charcoal grey suit with a subtle pinstripe and carried a small leather briefcase. His demeanor was steady and silent. By the time the staff began filtering in through the employee entrance, he was already seated in the conference room waiting. A senior compliance officer from corporate was flown in from Chicago and greeted him with both hands. Alongside her was a legal advisor from the founding board and a public relations official who said little and only took notes. The branch was instructed to suspend all teleservices for the first 2 hours of the day. A notice was taped to the glass doors stating that operations were delayed due to internal review. No customer complaints were accepted. Phones rang but were not answered. Inside the conference room, Arthur reviewed the audit binder that had been prepared overnight. He flipped through customer incident reports, hiring logs, performance reviews. The binder was over 200 pages. He stopped at the section on customer service feedback and pointed to a column marked Unresolved Complaints. He asked how many had been flagged in the last fiscal year involving staff at the teller line. The compliance officer answered 23. He nodded slowly, then circled 3 entries and asked what disciplinary action had been taken. She looked uncomfortable. None were documented. Arthur placed the pen down. Then he asked to see the hiring protocol used by the branch manager over the last 2 years. A file was handed to him. He scanned it quickly and noticed something. Of the 12 hires made in that time frame, only 1 was a person of color, and that person was Jamie. The rest matched a single demographic pattern: age, ethnicity, education. It was a clear red flag. He looked at the legal advisor and said, "I am requesting a full third-party review of all hiring and promotion practices at this branch, with a specific focus on bias metrics and diversity failure." The advisor nodded without protest. Arthur turned the page again and pointed to the surveillance summary from the day of the incident. The compliance officer said the footage showed clear misconduct by both teller and security staff. Then she looked up and added, "We believe the manager's response was dismissive and insufficient." Arthur closed the binder and folded his hands. "I will be submitting this report to the board, along with my recommendation for executive disciplinary action." He paused. "Furthermore, I would like this branch removed from self-governance status and placed under direct oversight from headquarters until corrective reforms are complete." The PR officer's pen stopped mid-sentence. Arthur looked across the table at the entire group. "I did not build this bank to serve investors. I built it to serve people. If that mission has been lost in the name of growth or efficiency, then it is the job of the board to bring it back." No one in the room disagreed. At that moment, Arthur stood and walked to the window. Outside, the morning light hit the sidewalk. A small group of customers was gathering near the doors waiting for the branch to open. Arthur looked down at them, then back at the table. "This is not about me. This is about what happens when a system forgets who it was meant to serve." He walked out of the room without waiting for a reply. 2 days after the internal review began, a photo appeared on social media. It was a grainy cell phone shot taken from across the street. It showed a sharply dressed elderly black man walking out of the branch, holding a leather briefcase with 2 senior bank officials walking beside him. The caption was "Simple founder of the bank who was humiliated, now returns to audit it." Within hours, it was reposted to a community page, then picked up by a civil rights journalist on Twitter who began digging. A thread appeared with screenshots of internal memos leaked by a junior compliance officer who had been watching quietly from corporate. The memos confirmed that Arthur Thomas had once chaired the founding board of the very institution that had called security on him. Within 1 day, the story exploded across Reddit, TikTok, and Facebook. One TikTok video with over 3 million views showed a reenactment of the incident outside the bank, with actors portraying the teller, the manager, and the elderly man. The ending text said, "He created the system, and they tried to erase him." Hashtags began trending. Founder thrown out, bank justice, Arthur Thomas story. Local news stations began circling the story. A reporter knocked on the glass doors of the branch during business hours. Staff refused to comment. The corporate office issued a generic, public statement saying the matter was under investigation and appropriate measures were being taken. But that was not enough. CNN picked up the story within the week, followed by MSNBC. A panel segment titled "Systemic Bias in the Banking Industry" featured Arthur's photo and a timeline of events leading to the public backlash. Activist groups called for a nationwide review of discriminatory practices in financial institutions. Even members of Congress tweeted support, calling the story a wake-up call for how we treat our elders and our history. Jamie sat at home watching the news with her phone buzzing non-stop. Friends, co-workers, people she hadn't spoken to in years were messaging her asking if she had been there. She didn't respond. Instead, she just watched as the country began, paying attention. Melissa was placed on unpaid administrative leave, and the branch manager had not returned to work since the audit. Anonymous sources claimed he had lawyered up. The pressure kept mounting. Editorial columns were written. Op-eds with titles like "When Founders Get Forgotten" and "The Invisible Fathers of American Finance" began appearing in major papers. Arthur never gave an interview, not once. But his silence spoke louder than words. The story was no longer just about one man. It had become a symbol, a mirror, and millions were looking into it. 1 week after the story broke nationally, the headquarters of the banking institution released a televised statement. The current CEO, a white man in his late 50s, stood in front of the company's flagship building with reporters gathered beneath the marble steps. His voice was calm but heavy. He began by acknowledging that what happened at the Willow Creek branch was unacceptable. He said the organization had failed, not just in one moment but in its culture and practices. Then he paused and said the name Arthur Thomas clearly into the microphone. He said Mr. Thomas was not only a founder, but a guiding voice whose legacy had been ignored and whose dignity had been violated. He said the bank would immediately begin an internal overhaul. Effective that week, all senior managers would undergo mandatory training on racial equity and customer relations. The CEO also announced the formation of an independent equity and inclusion board with authority to audit any branch without prior notice. He continued by saying that the teller involved had been terminated and that the branch manager had been removed from his position indefinitely pending legal review. A new branch leader would be appointed after a public community forum involving local residents. He added that Mr. Thomas had declined to press legal charges, but had personally advised on the scope of the reforms. The camera panned slightly and caught Arthur standing behind the press line dressed in a plain navy suit with no tie. He said nothing. He simply watched. The statement was carried live on several networks. Financial analysts debated whether the story would hurt the company's stock, but public trust appeared to stabilize. Letters poured in from all over the country. Customers, former employees, young black students studying finance. One letter read, "I never thought someone like me could build a bank. Now I do." The bank headquarters released a follow-up memo to all employees detailing the new accountability system, anonymous reporting hotlines, monthly audits, community accountability panels. For the first time in the institution's history, it was not profit-driving change. It was consequence. And somewhere deep inside the system, a shift had begun. Quiet, but real. 3 weeks after the reforms were announced, the Willow Creek branch opened its doors for a community event. The lobby had been cleared of transaction lines and filled instead with rows of chairs, a microphone stand, and a display that featured historical photos from the bank's early years. In the center of the display was a black and white portrait of a much younger Arthur Thomas, standing on scaffolding next to the original construction site of the bank's first location. People filled the room quickly. Some were staff, others were neighbors. Local school children came with notepads. Reporters were not invited, but word still spread. At exactly 10 o'clock, Arthur arrived. He wore a formal 3-piece suit in deep gray with a silver pin on his lapel and a leather-bound folder in one hand. The same teller's station where he had once been humiliated had been removed. In its place stood a small platform with a wooden lectern. As he stepped up to the front, every employee in the room stood without being told. No one looked at their phones. No one shuffled. They simply watched. Arthur did not begin with thanks. He did not speak about what had happened. He began with the story of why he started the bank. He spoke of 1964, when no one in his community could get a loan not because they lacked credit, but because they lacked the right face. He spoke of the meetings he had held in church basements, the money he pooled from barbers and teachers and grandmothers, to open an institution that would not turn away people based on their skin. He spoke of the years it took to gain charter status and the moment he finally signed the founding papers. Then he paused, looked at every face in the room, and said slowly, I did not build a bank for power. I built it so people like me would never be shut out again. That silence was heavier than applause. It hung in the room like truth. He closed the folder, walked down from the platform, and as he left the building, every employee lined up on both sides, forming a quiet, respectful corridor. He did not stop. He did not smile. He walked forward into a world that had finally remembered him.